Today we're going to talk about camera settings for shooting music videos.
Cracka Lack on the track.
What's up everyone, my name is Cracka Lack. Welcome back to Cracka Lack TV. Today we're going to talk about camera settings for shooting music videos. So I've been shooting music videos for over 10 years now. I've shot over 300 music videos and I have a lot of ideas for tip and tutorial type videos for my fellow peers on the come up that are shooting videos. But before we do all of these tutorials that I have planned, we got to get to the fundamentals first. And the fundamentals is the actual settings with shooting music videos. So to make sure you're notified when all of these good future videos drop and these tutorials and tip videos, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell to be notified for future uploads. Alright, so camera settings for shooting music videos. So it's all about getting the perfect exposure. So if you overexpose, your video is going to look way too bright and it's going to look like shit. I'm going to show you guys an example on the screen. And then also if you underexpose, your video is gonna look too dark and that's also gonna look like shit. I'll show you another example. Alright, so let's talk about getting the perfect exposure. I'm gonna be going over frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, f-stop, and then also ISO. Alright, so when you're shooting music videos, you're gonna be filming one of two things. It's either the performance shots, and that's anytime you get the artist actually saying the words to the song. The B-roll is everything else. Any type of slow-mo, any type of them moving, you get capturing the scenery, flying the drone, anything other than the performance shots. That's what B-roll is. So for the performance shots, I recommend that you film at the highest quality that you can at 24 frames per second. So if you got a camera that can film 4K, set your settings to 4K, 24 frames per second. If the best your camera can film is 1080, put it 1080, 24 frames per second. Now, you can also film the performance shots in 60 frames per second, so that way you can slow it down and then speed it up, and then get them actually like vibing to the song and then have it go slow motion and then speed it back up, and then now they're back on beat with the words. So you can do that as well. But the general basic settings, this is what I learned, was anytime you film your performance shots, go 24 frames per second. Anytime you film your B-roll, go 60 frames per second. Now for your B-roll, make sure you're filming at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second or whatever other settings that your camera has. But most cameras can film at 60 frames per second, and then some better ones can film at 120 or even higher. But that is for slow motion, so you can slow it down because your end video should be 24 frames per second. One thing I notice about a lot of, I guess you would call them like amateur videos, is when people would upload them in like 60 frames per second and they just look weird. And if you're wondering like why do they look weird, it's because the 60 frames per second, like what we're used to seeing, what we're accustomed to seeing, is the 24 frames per second. I believe that's what they film movies, TV shows, and shit like that. Alright, so shutter speed. Your shutter speed should be 1 over double whatever your frame rate is. So if you're filming at 24 frames per second, you want a shutter speed of at least 50. If you're filming slow-mo at 60 frames per second, you want to make sure your shutter speed is at least 120, 125. And if you're filming 120 frames per second slow-mo, make sure you got your shutter speed of at least 240, 250. Also with shutter speed, the lower your shutter speed, the brighter your video is gonna be. The higher your shutter speed, the darker it's gonna be. Now a tip, one thing that I like to do is if the song has like a high energy, it's a real hype, upbeat type song, or if you wanna capture like some real action style filming, what I'll do a lot is I'll film at 4K, so 24 frames per second, but I'll crank my shutter speed up to like 200 or sometimes even like 400, 500. I'll be holding the camera and I do this like shaky twitch kind of fast movement, high energy, and it gives the video a dope ass look. So try that shit out if you've never done it before. Now lots of bad slow motion comes from your shutter speed being set wrong. So if you got your shutter speed set to like 50 but you're filming 60 frames per second, the shutter speed is too slow to capture all of the frames in there. So that's how you get that ghosting look. And then also, let's say you're filming an artist and he's moving a lot, he's moving his hands and stuff like this, the lighting is not that good, it'll sometimes give it this ghosting look. I remember one of my first like nighttime music videos that I shot, I had that effect where it was like this bad ghosting, and I reached out to a veteran photographer guy and he was saying that yeah, you probably had your shutter speed too low. Alright, so the aperture f-stop is your depth of field. When you think of like a really cinematic picture or a video, when someone's doing this and the fingers in focus but the face is blurry, that's from setting your aperture really low. So like a f1.8, f1.4, even a f2.8, can give you that drastic look. It's actually called bokeh, when you got the lights that are all out of focus. One tip is to film like a 60 frames or 120 frames per second slow-mo shot for like the intro of the music video. I do that a lot, where I'll get a real close-up of like some lights, and I'll set my aperture all the way down to like 1.8, and I'll get some lights that are real out of focus, and I'll add some sort of movement with it. But that's just a tip for you right there. One thing to remember with your aperture is the lower you set your aperture, let's say you go down to like 1.8, the brighter your video will be. The higher your aperture, like 8, 9, 10, 11, the darker it'll be. So a lot of the lenses that are known for being good in low light, they have a low aperture like 1.8. So the lower your aperture, the brighter it is, and the more shallow depth of field you have. But then the higher you set your aperture, the more everything's in focus. Like if you picture the sky and it's just kind of like everything looks in focus, that's because your phone is using a higher aperture. Let's say you're in a situation where it's nighttime or you're indoor, your lighting sucks, it's pretty dark in there. You're gonna drop your aperture as low as you can, and then let's say in the opposite, you go outside in the daytime and it's super bright, you're gonna have to raise your aperture up to darken your video. Now tip, let's say you want to keep that cinematic look, to have the low aperture, that shallow depth of field, but it's still too bright. You can buy ND filters. It's like an adapter that twists on the front of your lens, and I would say the simple way to describe an ND filter is kind of like sunglasses for your actual camera lens. Now I personally don't own any ND filters, so what I end up doing is I just crank my shutter speed super high. And I know that that's not technically what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to keep that shutter speed, if I'm filming at 24, at like 50. But if it's too bright, and again I don't have the ND filters, I'll just crank my shutter speed to like 1,000, sometimes even 2,000. And I've never noticed any crazy like bad look from doing so. Alright, so now ISO. ISO is the last setting that you're going to have to adjust. And pretty much you want to keep your ISO as low as you can, giving yourself the best exposure. Because when you put your ISO too high, that's what causes, it's called noise. When you look into the shadows and you see all these crazy dots flashing and popping up, that's noise, and that's from having your ISO too high. But again, sometimes you might be in a situation where the lighting sucks, you got your aperture all the way low, you got your shutter speed down, and it's still too dark. That's when you just have to crank your ISO up just enough to get good enough exposure for your video. Did I just do it that fast? Hey, yeah, I'm pretty sure I went over everything. If you guys found this video helpful, please do me a favor and give the video a thumbs up, and also drop a comment and give me ideas for future tutorials that you would like me to share on this channel right here. Again, make sure you don't miss any of this good ass content that's coming your way. So subscribe and hit the bell to be notified for future uploads. Cracka Lack TV, we out. I just filmed my first tutorial right here. Hey. Follow me on Instagram at Cracka_Lack, Twitter Cracka Lack. I'm on Facebook Cracka Lack. Let's get it.